Can science explain everything? If you Google science and religion, you'll think you've entered a war zone in which there are two sides, science and God, battling with one another. The science side regard themselves as the voice of reason, where science is an unstoppable force for human flourishing that's going to deliver answers to all human problems, poverty, disease, energy, and so on. And one day the science side hopes that all our big worldview questions, such as where we come from, where we're going to, what are we here for, what's the meaning of our existence, will be solved by science. But then there's the God side. They look at the complexity and wonder of the universe and our astonishingly rich and diverse planet, and they say it's self-evident that there is an intelligent God behind it. And sometimes the tension between the two sides is such that we get heated argument that leads many people to think that science and God, like metallic sodium and water, just don't mix. Put them together and you get an explosion. Now, my objective in this talk is to say, for you to discuss that this is wrong. God and science mix extremely well, like hydrogen and oxygen, to give us life-giving water. So first of all, what do we mean by science? The word itself comes from the Latin scire, to know, and it used to mean all knowledge of every kind. And of course, if that's what you mean by science, of course it explains everything. If you mean by explanation, gaining knowledge and understanding. But the meaning has changed, and now in the West, science means the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, astronomy, and so on, a set of intellectual disciplines that we use to investigate the universe around us. Now, science is very difficult to capture by definition, but I'm sure that you know various things about how science works. For instance, making observations, setting up a hypothesis to explain them, testing that hypothesis by more observations and devising experiments, and then beginning to set up a theory, and so on. It's important to realize, though, that not all science is done by repeated experimentation. For instance, when we're trying to understand things that cannot be repeated in a laboratory, like the origin of life, then of course we can't do that by experiment. So we have to use a method that we can call a historical method, inference to the best explanation. And sometimes this is referred to as historical science. The method is used by the best detectives at the end of an Agatha Christie story, where the detective make inferences to the best explanation. And that's what we do in general in forensic medicine. You can't repeat a murder to see who did it. So in the end, you have to collect evidence and make an inference to the best explanation. And while we're speaking about history, it's very important to see that there's a deep connection between the rise of modern science in the 16th and 17th centuries and Christianity. The pioneers of modern science, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Clerk Maxwell, and so on, were all believers in God. And C.S. Lewis connects the two by saying men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator, a lawgiver. And incidentally, it's interesting to know that in the years between 1900 and 2000, over 65% of Nobel Prize winners actually believed in God. And today there are many top scientists who are Christian believers, like artificial intelligence expert Dr. Rosalind Picard at MIT, like Professor of Chemistry, Computing and Nanotechnology Jim Tour in Rice University, and Dr. Francis Collins, Director of the National Institutes of Health and current winner of the Templeton Prize. And so, at a much more modest level, am I. Now, how is that possible if science explains everything? Well, the simple first answer to that is that science doesn't explain everything. Science is successful at what it does, but it cannot do everything. So let's think a bit about scientific explanation. And the first thing that may surprise you is that a scientific explanation may not explain what you think it explains. For example, Newton's law of gravity doesn't explain gravity, and Newton himself said so. It gives us a wonderful way of calculating the motion of heavy bodies in relationship to one another under gravity. And it's accurate enough for us to land people on the moon, but it doesn't tell you what gravity is. No one really understands what gravity is. So within itself, it's not giving you an exhaustive explanation. Then the second thing is that there are different levels of explanation, of which science is only one. You imagine that my Aunt Matilda has baked a cake, and I sent it for analysis to a group of the world's top scientists. Well, the biochemists tell me about the structure of the proteins and fats and so on in the cake. The chemists analyze the elements, the physicists will reduce it to elementary particles, and the mathematicians will no doubt offer us a set of equations to describe the behavior of the particles. Now, we know how the cake was made. We've had all the top experts on it. We know what it's made of. But suppose we now say to the scientists, please tell us before you go why the cake was made. And there's Aunt Matilda. She's standing beside her cake, and of course she begins to smile because she knows why it was made. She made it. But it's surely obvious that the best scientists in the world will not be able to tell from their scientific investigations why she made the cake. Indeed, they'll never know unless she reveals it to them by telling them. And that is a very important, though simple, illustration. The natural sciences can cope very well with questions about the nature and structure of the cake, but they cannot answer the why question of purpose. Why was the cake made? And that shows you at once that science has its limits. And this is recognized by the very best of scientists. Sir Peter Medawar won the Nobel Prize for chemistry, and he points out that the existence of a limit to science is very likely. Why? Because science cannot answer the questions of a child, such as how did everything begin? What are we here for? What is the point of living? And he says it's to literature and philosophy and such things that we must turn for answers to those questions. Now let's look at this more carefully, because there are different kinds of explaining things. Here is water boiling in a kettle. Explain it. Well, it's boiling because the heat energy is being transmitted from an electric element to the water. It's agitating the molecules of water, and so it's boiling. But actually there's more to it than that. It's boiling because I'd very much like to have a cup of tea. Now, there are two explanations of the same thing. They are different explanations. The first is a scientific explanation in terms of heat. The second is an explanation in terms of an agent, me, and my desire for a cup of tea. Now, notice something here that's very important. These explanations do not conflict, they do not compete, but they complement one another. Both are necessary for a full explanation. And indeed, the second is more important than the first, outside the laboratory, that is. People have been enjoying tea for centuries before they understood anything about the physics of heat. So a science explanation is different from an agent explanation. And Richard Dawkins, for one, does not seem to understand this simple point. He thinks the God explanation, which is an agent explanation, is the same kind of explanation as a science explanation. And so he tells people they have to choose between God and science. But that's foolish, if I may say so. It's like saying, here's the boiling water in the kettle. There are two possible explanations, the physics of heat or my desire for a cup of tea. You must choose between the two. Nonsense. You can, and indeed must, have both explanations together. Now notice another thing. Both of these explanations are rational. They're reasonable explanations. Many people today think that science and reason are the same thing. They are not. We hope that science is reasoned out, but reason doesn't stop with science. There are many other disciplines. In fact, most intellectual disciplines involve our rationality to the hilt, like history, economics, philosophy, theology, but they are not natural science. Now, what can we learn from this? Well, the scientific explanation is rarely the complete explanation. And God and science no more compete as explanations for the universe than I compete with the physics of heat to explain a boiling kettle. Now this seems to me so clear that it makes me wonder why leading atheist scientists keep saying we've got to choose between God and science. And there is another reason why they do that. It's to do now not with a misunderstanding about science, but a misunderstanding about God. Many today, like the late Stephen Hawking and Richard Dawkins, think that God is what is called a God of the gaps. That is, when we cannot explain something, we say a god did it. Like the ancient Greeks, they couldn't understand lightning, so they said God did it. Now, of course, you will see that once atmospheric physics comes along and explains lightning to us, that God disappears. But that God is not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is not a God of the gaps, he's God of the whole show. The bits we don't understand and the bits we do understand. I'm a mathematician. I understand Isaac Newton's mathematical description of the motion of the planets under gravity around the sun. And because I do, I admire his genius much more than someone who doesn't understand any maths. You see, it's the bits of the universe we do understand that lead us to admire the genius of the God that made them. So God of the Bible is not a God of the gaps, creator of the whole show. And now something else about explanation. Many people think that explanation is always reductionist. That is, it takes complex things and tries to explain them in terms of simpler things. Now, this is a very important form of explanation. For example, water can be reduced to hydrogen and oxygen, which are simple elements. That's a real explanation because it tells us that water is constituted from two simpler things. Now, Richard Dawkins will tell you, you see, God doesn't qualify as an explanation of anything anyway. Why? Because God, by definition, is much more complicated than the thing that you are explaining. But that sounds good, but it's just wrong. Think of traveling with an archaeologist in China and we're in a cave and she points to two scratches in the wall and suddenly she says, look at that. That means human intelligence. And I say, surely not. There are only two scratches in the wall and you're postulating something far more complicated to explain them. That's not an explanation at all. And she smiles at me and politely says, don't be silly. Those two scratches are the Chinese character Ren for a human being. And when I see them there, I know that human intelligence has been at work. And that is a real explanation, because the next thing I want to do is find out who these humans were that put the scratches on the cave wall. Now, this is something very important, because it shows that some explanations cannot be reductionistic. That is, you can't explain it from the bottom up. You have to explain it from the top down. Human intelligence at the top, the scratches at the bottom. And the particular area where that occurs is where language is concerned. The moment we see language, whether it's computer language, whether it's the language in the genes of DNA, or whether it's human language, we immediately think that intelligence must be involved. Although, of course, some atheists, when it comes to DNA, don't think that. And I've written about that elsewhere. But then again, when God is mentioned, Richard Dawkins will come back with a very famous objection. And he'll say this: look, if you believe that God created the universe, then surely you've got to ask who created God. Doesn't that make belief in God look pretty silly? No, it's the argument that is silly. Because, you see, if you ask the question, who or what created God, think about what you're assuming. You're assuming that God was created. But what if he wasn't? Then your question doesn't imply. You see, what's hidden in the question is that you're asking about created gods. Well, of course, we know they're not real. They are what we normally call idols. And so it's very important we realize that Richard Dawkins' question only applies to created things. The God of the Bible is not created. The God of the Bible is eternal. In the beginning, God already was, and he created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning was the Word. God is eternal and not created. But there's this thing in the tail here, because Dawkins' argument does apply to created things. And I asked him, look, I want to ask you your own question. You believe that the universe created you. All right then, who created your creator? And I've waited many years and never had an answer to it. So those are several things about explanation that we need to think about. But now we come to the next big issue, where people say religion depends on faith, but science doesn't. Well, now, faith is a very important word. And unfortunately, it has been redefined by many atheists to mean believing where there's no evidence. Now, that is just not true. Believing where there's no evidence is blind faith, and that can be very dangerous. Faith is an ordinary word. In English, it comes from the Latin word fides, from which we get fidelity, trustworthiness. And I would like to say to you that every person is a person of faith in something. If someone says to me, I have faith, I first of all ask, in what? Well, they say, I have faith in this thing, or that fact, or that person. The next logical question for me to ask is, what are the grounds for your faith, trust, or belief? You believe in global warming? Tell me why you believe it. You think that we will find a solution to the problem of death through artificial intelligence. What are the grounds for your belief? Because the only kind of faith worth having is faith that is evidence-based. And faith is deeply involved in science. It's not just a religious concept. Einstein once said he couldn't imagine a genuine scientist without that faith. He didn't mean faith in God. In the context, what he meant was faith in the fact that science could be done. Or to put it slightly more technically, faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe. You see, you can't do any science without believing that. The pioneers of modern science, Newton and the others, believed the universe was intelligible. Why did they believe that? Because they believed that there was a rational creator behind it. Scientists expect you to believe their theories. And if you ask them why should they, I hope they will provide evidence. Now, I cannot, of course, speak for other religions. They must speak for themselves. But as far as Christianity concerns, the faith that Christianity tells us about, faith in God and Christ, is firmly evidence-based. I would have no interest in it otherwise. The Gospel writer John explains this, and he says in chapter 20:31, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name." John is telling us that his account of the signs that Jesus did is a record, an eyewitness record on which faith can be based. And a very strong case can be made that much of the material in the Gospels is based on eyewitness historical testimony. So you cannot say that science depends on faith and reason, but Christianity doesn't. Science depends on faith and reason. Christianity depends on faith and reason, and both should be founded on evidence. But then comes a major final point. People say, but look, the bottom line is this: Christianity is based on miracles, but science says they cannot happen. For instance, the central claim of Christianity is that Jesus rose from the dead. How am I to take that? Am I to take it as an event in history? Because if I do, then clearly it was something supernatural. And we'll be told, particularly by atheists, that we've got to choose between exclusive alternatives. Either we believe in the possibility of miracles, or we believe in the scientific understanding of the laws of nature, but not both. Now, why did they think that? Well, it all really goes back to the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume, who said that miracles are violations of the laws of nature. So if you're a scientist and believe in the laws of nature, as you must, then you can't believe in miracles. Interestingly, the example that Hume gave was that resurrection is impossible in his view. But it can't be quite as simple as that. There are very highly intelligent, eminent scientists, I've named some of them, who disagree with him. And they do believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Bill Phillips, Physics Nobel Prize winner, and Francis Collins, to name just two. They are very well aware of Hume's argument, and yet without embarrassment they will publicly confess they believe in the resurrection, and they believe that the resurrection of Jesus is a supreme evidence for the truth of Christianity. Now, Francis Collins gives a very wise caution regarding the matter of miracles in general. He says it's crucial that a healthy skepticism is applied when interpreting potentially miraculous events, lest the integrity and rationality of the religious perspective be brought into question. The only thing that will kill the possibility of miracles more quickly than a committed materialism is the claiming of miracle status for everyday events for which natural explanations are readily at hand. So let's concentrate on the central miracle of Christianity, the resurrection of Jesus. Hume's objection is this: now that we know the laws of nature, miracles are impossible. His reasoning is completely wrong, and it's quite easy to see, as C.S. Lewis pointed out. Suppose this week I put $10 in the drawer of my desk, and the following week I put in a further 20, and the week after that another 10, and then the drawer is closed. The laws of arithmetic allow me to predict that the next time I open the drawer I shall find $40. But suppose when I next open it I find just one $10 note. What do I conclude from that? Do I conclude that the laws of arithmetic have been broken? Of course not. What I conclude is that the laws of the United States have been broken. You see, it'd be ludicrous to claim that the existence of the laws of arithmetic make it impossible to believe in the existence of a thief who stole my money. Now let's get it clear. The laws of arithmetic haven't been broken. In fact, it's my knowledge of the laws of arithmetic that tell me that a thief has put his or her hand in and stolen the money. Now this is simple, but it explains a great deal, because you see, my mistake was to think that the drawer and my chest of drawers in my room was a closed system. But it wasn't. It was an open system, and so a thief could intervene from outside. God created the universe with its laws, which describe what normally happens, the regularities. But the universe is an open system. God can intervene to do something special. He can feed a new event in. It doesn't break the laws of nature. God isn't breaking any laws when he raises Christ from the dead, because he does that by injecting his mighty power. Jesus didn't rise by the normal operating of the regularities of nature. And that brings me to Hume's other objection, which we often hear. It's that belief in miracles in general, and the resurrection in particular, arose at a time when people in their thinking were pre-scientific and could accept miracles very easily. But that isn't true, you see. A moment's thought will show, in order to recognize some event as a miracle, then there must be a perceived regularity to which that event appears as an apparent exception. You cannot recognize something as abnormal if you do not know what is normal. And that was appreciated at the time of the New Testament. The historian Luke, who was trained in medical science, at the time he raises this very matter in his account of the rise of Christianity, and tells us that the first opposition to the resurrection claim of the Christians didn't come from atheists, in fact, but from the high priests of Judaism, highly religious men who were Sadducees. They believed in God, they said their prayers, they conducted services in the temple, but they didn't believe in the supernatural. And so the first time they heard the claim that Jesus had risen from the dead, they rejected it, because they had embraced a worldview that denied the possibility of bodily resurrection of anyone at all, let alone that of Jesus Christ. So you see, to suppose that Christianity was born in a pre-scientific, credulous and ignorant world is false to the facts. The ancient world knew, as well as we do, that dead bodies don't get up out of graves. Christianity won its way because of the sheer weight of evidence that one man had actually risen from the dead. And I have discussed that evidence in detail because it's of central importance to me as a scientist and a Christian in the last 2 chapters of my book, Gunning for God. Does science explain everything? No, it explains some things wonderfully, but there's a whole vast area of even greater importance where science doesn't explain at all, and we need much deeper levels of explanation, in particular the God explanation.